No, I think plenty. Sorry, Ty needs to go, but no, I think sensible adults could come to a negotiation between like wages, purpose, profit, all that kind of stuff. Particularly if they're all invested in the well-being of the institution long term.
I got a lot of faith in people, but not that much. That's not. That's just not how the evidence works out.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of faith in people, but I'll actually back up Connor on this one. Like, unions can be great, but there is a threshold here. You're absolutely right on this, Scott. Like, it's a lot harder to make a union power effective whenever you're talking about unskilled labor. But if there's anyone who probably needs the beneficial protections that unions can bring, it is unskilled labor. Yeah, it's harder. It requires more work, but like, they're really the guys that are getting screwed left, right, and center, because politics doesn't give a shit about them because they have no bargaining power. You know, economics barely gives a shit about them because they have no bargaining power. Union gives them both. Like, that's literally the number one thing you want to do as an investment, unless you are like trying to get an ESOP program going along to where you're actually like slowly becoming a part-time earner in your company. So, table that.
That would actually be dope. No, that would actually be dope. Like an ESOP model for rideshare program. That's probably the perfect place for an ESOP to work. No, I completely agree with you. That's why we need to get rid of minimum wage and get rid of crony capitalism that causes this to be the problem. You know, do things that actually work as opposed to things that we know don't work.
New York City has mandated that food delivery drivers be paid a minimum of $18 an hour plus tips. This surpasses the citywide $15 an hour mandate. Is this a success story for workers who might lose their job to accommodate the change? Is this a success story for restaurants who have long complained about the tiny margins that Uber Eats and DoorDash provides? Is this a success? Is this a win for consumers who will likely pay higher prices? Yeah, so this just happened the other day. Mayor Adams announced this. So it was like a citywide mandate that, you know, would these food delivery drivers, I'm not sure if they're just app-based or if it's just all food delivery drivers blanket, not quite sure. But in any case, they have to be paid $18 an hour plus tips. And there's some interesting, because there's so many stakeholders involved in this. I find it especially interesting, the restaurants and how the restaurants might feel about this, considering, again, those tiny margins. I can go more in detail to that later. But yeah, we'll start with our friend Lactoid.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with a general statement in that minimum wage generally is fucked. And there is no justification to dictate the terms of an association in a country that is supposed to stand behind free association as a founding principle. Minimum wage increases both crime and unemployment, according to Biden's White House own analysis. There was a paper they released a while ago in which they admitted this would lead to these outcomes. Why delivery drivers deserve even more is bizarre. And of course, this is going to hurt both restaurants, who, like both pointed out, have incredibly razor-thin margins, and consumers because now they will need to pay more, and restaurants because they're going to lose out on their business. Further, this is ableist, as disabled people who rely on food delivery will now need to pay more in order to get their food. Whatever the pay of the job is, whether it be growing food or delivering it, this pay should be entirely dictated by what people choose to pay, as comes with free association. Anyone who believes otherwise, I believe to some extent, people who are involved in it have a little bit of an entitlement mentality. And I think generally you are not entitled to the money of other people. You should have to get them to agree to give it to you, as any kind of free trade dictates. So,
okay. Scott, I imagine will have a completely opposite take. He generally doesn't agree with Lactoid. Opposite sides of the spectrum.
We get the good takes out first, and then we go through that.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So this is one where we obviously completely agree. Abolish minimum wage. Minimum wage. If we were to take the value structure and the form of analysis of the critical theorist, then minimum wage is both ableist and racist and gentrification. Its impact always impacts the lowest socioeconomic status Americans. What it does is it is this idea that everyone deserves a living wage for every type of work, and this is bullshit. It's not true. Some jobs are priced out of the market because of minimum wage that are jobs that aren't meant to be living jobs. Thomas Sowell gives a great example of this in Basic Economics, where he talks about the job that used to exist that was mostly done by teenagers and kids that were learning the value of work which was going up and down the aisle in movie theaters and taking people to their seat. It was a wonderful service, but it's not worth minimum wage. And so they just get rid of the service. The service no longer exists. And what this does is puts economic pressure on poor people that are already at the end of the distribution, because now they have more competition in the labor market. It is harder for them to get a job. And all of this actually suppresses wages. Minimum wage does not change the value of a dollar. It doesn't change the value of an hour's worth of labor either. So when you raise the minimum wage, all you do is increase inflation, because if your labor is valued at a certain point, then that money has to come from somewhere. And once that money starts trickling through all of the different processes, it leads to increased prices, increased taxes, increased difficulty of so many other things. And eventually what you end up with is, yay, we raise the minimum wage. Now food delivery is more expensive. To give the left their fair shake, the reason that this exists is because people that are doing this are also using their car. And so the argument is that they need a higher minimum wage because they're putting stress on their car. It's a stupid argument. It's unhelpful. And then the last thing I want to say is, in terms of the businesses, the restaurants that have very small margins, this is on purpose. You know, people bitch about business because they don't understand business, and they bitch about economics because they don't understand economics. That is a majority of the people that are complaining. The reason restaurants do this at razor thin margins is because it's still profitable to them. It's not profitable so much as it is the direct profit they get. It's profitable because sometimes people do not want to sit down at a restaurant and try their food and try their experience. What they'll do is they'll order it on an app, determine that they really like the food there, and then they'll say to their friends, we should go check this restaurant out sometime. It's a form of marketing. It's a form of driving business to those establishments because they try the food first. So there you go.
Thank you. Corey.
I'll try to keep it brief. There are definitely some valid points that Lactoid brings up, and Scott as well. And while, even though I'm generally in favor, largely for raising minimum wage, I do not see it as universally good across the board, as in there appear to be some circumstances where some minimum wage can have some deleterious effects, as in, for example, some data I've seen of, like, if you raise minimum wage, for some part-time workers, companies end up adjusting their hours so that they start working less hours as a result of that, et cetera, et cetera. So I definitely can see some potential detrimental effects of raising minimum wage. But all that being said, when it comes to this specific circumstance, where they're like an independent contractor, I pretty much am in favor of giving this a try. As of right now, I can see it going both ways, but I'm pretty much in favor of giving this a good go because I think this can lead to good outcomes. And I'll leave it there for now.
Points.
I am in favor of this policy because it is racist.
Give
sexist,
authoritarianism
and ableist.
a try.
No, okay, non-meme answer. I think that the end goal of having people be employed and able to afford their standards of living is fine. I think that the policy is dog shit for the reasons that Lactoid and Scott mentioned, which is basically the cost will be passed on to the consumer, the cost will be passed on to the logistics of the businesses, and what you're going to have is a weaker service with, basically less access to people who want that service. However, that being said, I still wouldn't be principally opposed to the wage of these workers being $18. What I would say is abolish the minimum wage and bring back unions. The unions could be free association. The unions could be, they have to follow certain standards because there were unions who were engaged in criminal behavior. But I would have no problems if the food service workers came up and they said, we're contract labor. You're paying us dog shit. We're running our cars into the ground for you as a business. You are not paying it. You're paying us what seems to be a good rate wage up front. But when you factor in the wear and tear to our vehicles, we're actually breaking even, and we might as well be doing minimum wage work. So as a result, we want these standards of care for our vehicle. We want this for, per diem, fuel mileage, health benefits, pay, whatever. And I have no problems with them as a category of worker doing that. So fuck the minimum wage, but in general, the end game, the end game of the priority of the policy is admirable.
Okay, Ty.
Yeah, so first things first, when it comes to minimum wage, in economic theory, basically is that it's kind of a trap. You can do some good with it. We've seen basically what we call the demand curve be pushed up with it on some regards. But on the other side is that it's price floor. And when you have price floors is that you get price distortions and you get market distortions because of that. Now, the other side of that is that what is the ethical foundation of what a minimum wage is? Is that we're basically saying, hey, look, you can't pay anybody this. Like, you have to meet a certain threshold here. And I actually openly support that. There's a certain point where I'm just like, I don't care if you want to just call them a delinquent or whatever. If you're taking $5 to mow people's lawns every 2 hours, fuck that shit. You should not be working. So, anyway, moving on forward is that...
I thought you were done. Sorry.
Yeah, I apologize. No, I had to stop there for a second. Anyway, yeah, just moving on forward with that. When it comes to this kind of a work, I've done it myself. I have worked for DoorDash for over 4 months at one point. I get why people want to do that. I get where it kind of works for some folks. The problem is that if there is any industry right now that I think is just on the ethical ledge of just being outlawed, it's this one, because of the reasons that Connor actually said. Is that on the front door? Yeah, it's like, hey, you can make $30 an hour. Sounds great, but it's not secure. It's not consistent. And it gets to the point where, yeah, you're paying money out the nose for, more car insurance and wear and tear and all this to where you're barely breaking even. And that's if you're good at it. I absolutely have no problem with these folks trying to go after them in this particular way, or I'm sorry, not in this particular way, but just going after this industry. The problem is that as an administrative point of view, I don't think this is going to work. I think they should have just actually put in the political capital to raise the minimum wage for everyone in New York City to $18 an hour. And you would actually have done more good in that regard. I'll end with that.
Okay, Aiko.
I also okay, so I'm kind of on the fence about this. And I kind of agree with Corey's idea that it should be studied, and so the extent to which it should be studied, I guess we should have some areas try to do it and see what's going to happen. I'm very skeptical that something like this is going to work. I do think that even though it'll make the price of food more expensive, it seems as if there's no limit to what people are willing to pay to have food delivered, though. So I think that we will see increased prices when something like this happens. But I think people we're just incredibly lazy. People are willing to pay a lot to have their food delivered instead of having to just go 2 blocks down the road and pick something up. I've done the math myself. I've ordered from these services before. And I think the first time I actually went and picked it up instead, I was shocked at how much less it was when I went to go pick it up, to the point where it's almost income to choose to pick up your own food at a restaurant, because by going to pick it up, you just earn $10 in 10 minutes. And that's nowhere near what the people who are driving for these services are making. And so I do think that it's almost a stupid tax, both when it comes to the people who are ordering the food and for the people who are delivering the food, because they don't realize it when they're doing it. But all of the wear and tear on the car and all these sort of extra associated costs with doing the job are something that they often don't calculate in their heads when they choose to do these things. And so they end up having to get a new car 2 years earlier than they otherwise would. And all of a sudden they're surprised when they don't have the resources to do that, because they weren't making those calculations. So I'd like to see what the outcome of this is several years down the road. I've been a big critic of people who say, oh, that minimum wage jobs have these sort of big negative consequences, because then the studies come out and it turns out to be fine, what happened in Seattle, for instance. But here, I really do think that some of those negative outcomes may result both on the consumer side and on the employee side. And I really would like to see that data.
Okay, and Doobie.
So it's really unfortunate, but I agree with Lactoid and Connor and Scott and their way of thinking on this. So, suck.
Well, yeah, we're a fucking boss, so of course you would. All right, so I'll give my opinion. Man, he's used to crushing people under his boot. So
Wait, which
forming
positions?
consensual contracts, okay?
You support Connor's position because it's sexist, ableist, and racist? Is that the
Yeah.
So I'll give my opinion, right? As the only tough, strong lefty. Well, Corey's a good lefty.
Don't worry, I'll back up the lefty side. It's okay.
All right, but yeah, absolutely. we should have a minimum wage. Putting it out there. We'll talk about that, I'm sure. But look, Aiko kind of stole a few of the points I was going to make there. But I think that it makes sense that if you want this service, right? If you want this service, you want to go pay, get someone to deliver it to you, then like you're gonna have to pay some sort of premium. I'm okay with the consumer paying more for this. I occasionally order from this restaurant. I don't use Uber Eats. I order directly from the restaurant, but they have delivery, and I would take that delivery. It would be great, but like I stopped doing it because of exactly what Aiko said. It was like it was tips. It was actually the tip, right? Because I'm not gonna like let this guy go up on a tip, and I just wanted to save the tip, and so I would just like end up driving, you know. So like there's a premium to this service, and you just gotta have to accept that. And if that premium includes people being able to properly support themselves and their family, then it's one that we should all be happy to pay. It simply is the case. I think it's interesting that we don't question when bosses decide to just like raise prices. When that happens, I don't see all this fretting, especially on the right, about what are the consequences of all these things. No one seems to care, but they care a lot when workers fight for themselves. And last thing I'll say to Aiko, really, you said it was the stupid tax on people because they're not calculating the wear and tear on their car. I would disagree with that. I think one, Aiko, did you
scared him off?
Did I win? Okay. Well, I'll just say my point. Yeah. So I think a lot of people do calculate that one or the other, but even if they don't, you cannot eat your car. That's what people don't forget or don't remember. You can't eat your car. Yes, it's true. You're taking value out of your car. It's like a loan you're taking out of your car. You're taking value from there, and you're putting it in your mouth and the mouths of your family. So it's a perfectly rational like calculation to do such a thing. So I disagree with calling it a stupid tax. All right, everyone else. So
Primekaz, what you're really describing from like an Austrian perspective is high versus low time preference, right? And so this is a market. This is an understanding of individuals and how they choose to invest and spend their money, right? So free markets encourage low time preference, whereas socialism encourages high time preference, right? Which is to say, a high time preference means that you want the money now, and you're less likely to invest, or you're more likely to spend extra discretionary spending now, as opposed to putting it away for something later. Right. So individuals that tend to do ride share or, delivery services, they have very high time preference. They want the money now, and they value the money now more than they value the future, more than they devalue the future costs to damage to their vehicle, et cetera, et cetera. Whether or not that's a good decision, honestly, that just depends upon the person, right? Like, I think you kind of both could look at that, right? If someone can't eat right now, right, then obviously they're going to tend towards high time preference to figure out a way to make money right now in the hopes that they figure out something in the future, or that they get a better job because they view this as like a temporary thing, etc. But yeah, what I find interesting about both Eichhorich and Primekaz's explanation is that they kind of defeat their own argument with their own preferences and choice, which is to say, you both recognize that as costs go up, that it's not a perfectly elastic good, like let's say oil, right? Like oil is the closest thing we have to a perfectly elastic good. Like no matter how expensive oil is, you still need it to manufacture and mass produce things and ship things. So you're basically willing to pay the price of oil unless it gets so fucking high that it's worth investing millions of your own money to find alternative fuel sources, right? But you just proved that like food delivery is not that elastic, actually. Is that like it reaches a certain point where it becomes a luxury, it becomes, as opposed to just a simple convenience, and therefore you're going to use the program less, which means there will be less available jobs. And you specifically explain how putting in a new price floor on the wages of these workers means less available jobs in the market, means less people can actually do this position. And when there's less people working at all with no money, That means that's more competition in the labor market, which drives down wages and makes everyone poorer. That's what fucking minimum wage does, is it increases poverty. And in the short term, before the inflation kicks in, because inflation takes a while for it to balance out, right? Immediately, inflation takes a while.
Not wrong.
Inflation takes a while to bottom out. And so what companies do is they understand that the inflation's not going to kick in for a year or two when these wages come up. So they invest now before the inflation kicks in on automation to get rid of jobs because it's cheaper for them to do so. Like, that's what you're encouraging, is less jobs and more poverty when you argue for a minimum wage.
So
I got one.
Before I go, if Counter wanted to jump in, then I'll let him go.
Yeah, okay.
I can respond
So
later on. And Ty,
this
do you
is
wanna
why.
go after?
Yes, I do.
This
Go ahead,
is
Connor.
why, I think that unions are an okay thing, especially if they're voluntary, especially if they're not compelled, especially if they have like a broad enough influence in order to negotiate with wages and all that kind of stuff. Because I think that if you were a part of a union and you're just, I don't know, like retail, restaurant, whatever, and you're working at a smaller shop, it's a mom and pop business, and they're like, hey, I can literally only pay you $5 an hour because we're just getting started, et cetera, et cetera. You as the collective employees could say, hey, that's acceptable. We can do that. This is a starting business. We're trying to figure it out. We'll accept that, even though we're not getting health, vision, dental, et cetera, et cetera. And then a different company of a different size that has billions of dollars or millions of dollars in order to spend, and they're just spending it in ways that don't reinforce the wages, they can say, hey, listen, we've kind of looked at the books a little bit, and we know that there's a little bit of extra money more than you're saying. Let's go ahead and negotiate this shit. And so for me, the unions can be, not necessarily because people are like, pretty selfish bastards, but they can be good tools of market balance between the worker and the institution. Whereas right now, we're balancing everything to the institution.
There's a big problem with what you're saying. Everything you're saying is true for skilled labor. Because for skilled labor, like welding, for example, you can form a voluntary union, and it's difficult to replace you. It's really difficult to replace welders, right? Because there's a very limited pool of people that can do it. And even of the pool of people that can do it, they also have to learn like how that company prefers things done, et cetera, right? When you're talking about ride share and you're talking about food delivery service, the company can literally just fire every person in the union and get new people in the next fucking day because there's no skill involved in that job other than you can drive a car, which most Americans in populated areas can do, which is where these places focus anyway. So there's not a lot of food delivery out in the country or something.
Exactly.
And
I don't disagree with your philosophy. It just won't work.
Okay, quick rebuttal, and then I know Ty wants to go. I would make it legally mandatory that somebody cannot be fired merely for being a part of a union that's.
It's no longer a voluntary union, right? You're using the state to enforce. You're using political power and force and violence.
Let me clarify voluntary then. By voluntary, I mean that workers can choose to join it and be represented by it, or they can choose to not join it and be represented by it.
Yeah, but you just created the free rider problem and exacerbated it with the power of the state. You just made it more expensive for no reason without actually helping workers.
No, I think plenty. Sorry, Ty needs to go, but no, I think sensible adults could come to a negotiation between like wages, purpose, profit, all that kind of stuff, particularly if they're all invested in the well-being of the institution long term.
I got a lot of faith in people, but not that much. That's just not how the evidence works out.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of faith in people, but I'll actually back up Connor on this one. Like, unions can be great, but there is a threshold here. You're absolutely right on this, Scott. Like, it's a lot harder to make a union power effective whenever you're talking about unskilled labor. But if there's anyone who probably needs the beneficial protections that unions can bring, it is unskilled labor. Yeah, it's harder. It requires more work, but like they're really the guys that are getting screwed left, right, and center because politics doesn't give a shit about them because they have no bargaining power. Economics barely gives a shit about them because they have no bargaining power. Union gives them both. Like that's literally the number one thing you want to do as an investment, unless you are like trying to get an ESOP program going along to where you're actually like slowly becoming a part-time earner in your company. So table that.
That would actually be dope. No, that would actually be dope. Like an ESOP model for rideshare program. That's probably the perfect place for an ESOP to work.
Well,
effect.
okay.
fucking
What, can somebody explain ESOP? Because
Yeah, I don't know what
it's
that
a better
is.
solution. I don't care.
Yeah,
Like-
ESOPs are basically stock sharing programs to where you, as part of your payment, you are given like a certain amount of stock in any kind of company, and therefore you're like made into an owner. You can use that as a retirement. You can use it as a borrow against. It's just literally it's not liquid assets, standing assets.
But it's also, to be-
accruing.
To be fair,
Go ahead.
ESOPs usually have also have voting power. So
Yes.
people with more seniority and people with higher jobs get slightly more stock, and then those individuals have more say for voting. So like the janitor that's been there 20 years might have slightly more say than like an accountant, but the accountant gets quite a bit up front. There's like A and B shares. It gets kind of complicated, but imagine you took a co-op, the best things of a co-op and the best things of like a corporation, and you put them together. They
Okay,
work
so
in some places, they fail utterly in others.
Yeah, so I wanted to address this real quick, just because this Publix in the Southeast is my favorite example of a private company that does stock sharing with employees, and
Yeah, it's
they
an ESOP.
they have, oh, like they are so sick because basically like you have people literally with Down syndrome, because it's like I think it's like a relatively Christian organization or whatever. They specifically hire cashiers with like mental and physical disabilities in order to be stock clerks. They work there for 20 years, but because they have like a certain base level of stock availability at each like age, like where if you work there for like 3 years, you get a basic amount of shares, but you can buy more. And then, you know, if you're there for 10 years, you can buy more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's literally just people who haven't spent a dime or spent an ounce of their energy in studying investment, but because they got company stock and the company does well and they guard the interest of all the employees and the institution, they're retiring as like, they're not retiring as millionaires, but they're retiring with like 700 grand as a 50-year-old or 60-year-old person with a physical or mental disability, which is amazing.
Yeah, no, I think an ESOP model business that, you know, had enough capital investment could probably destroy Uber Eats and DoorDash and stuff like that. Probably be a little bit more expensive though. Be a little bit more expensive, but you'd get your food on time and you wouldn't be missing shit because people would give a fuck.
Ty, I think you
Yeah.
wanted to say something else.
I do have one more thing. It was actually my own point regarding this. So, like Scott's general analysis of minimum wage, I largely don't disagree with. The problem is like we're in this really weird time that's kind of a vacuum that I think that we want to capitalize on. I want to throw that out here real quick. Usually, if you're talking about the time of the boomers, right? Like when you have people who are just competing for wages and you're pushing the market down because you've got a shitload of labor. He's absolutely right. The problem is that right now, and I don't know how long this is going to last, but at least by the demographic data, it should last 15 years, is that we're in a worker shortage. We are actually seeing more jobs created and holding and maintained than actual people who want to work those jobs, which means the cost of labor for the last 3 years has been going up pretty significantly. It's been a little slow, you know, for some folks compared to others, but the floor is rapidly rising. I think that most minimum wages are just going to be completely useless, even the $15 ones in urban areas, because of how quick this is going to go. Anyway, to flash this out is that if you want to use minimum wage to actually actively help push up the floor, I think this is the one exception where this is the time to probably do it, because you will have it riding along with people who are still going up anyway.
I go. Did you
That was exactly the point I was going to make, was that we are now, I didn't really tie this to demographics, but we are, because of the time period that we're in, post-COVID recovery, where unemployment
Post-lockdown recovery. Blame the government, not the disease.
Well, yeah, you're right. Diseases are good. I forgot about that. But but I do think that I think demographics also sort of kicks into this. I think you're going to, although I think some of that's disguised by the fact that boomers are exiting the labor pool. So the LFPR is going to continue to rise because they're exiting the labor pool. But of course, that creates an even bigger problem, which means they're all going on Social Security here soon. So that's going to be its own problem that sort of runs parallel to this issue. But I think the fact is, you're also going to see a lot of retirees sort of picking up a lot of these jobs, and that won't be reflected in LFPR because they're we don't measure anyone over age 65. So it's going to be a little bit harder to measure what labor participation does in the next 10 to 15 years. But I do think that if we can leverage this opportunity now, to lock in the value of labor, we can have some idea of how to go forward after that. I just don't know what to do with about the fact that this is all temporary.
But what you're highlighting is a non-problem, and and even you said lock in the value of labor. There is no value of labor. Get that commie bullshit out of here, right? Get labor theory of value out of here. Pushing a rock up a hill and back down a hill for no reason has zero fucking value unless someone has some psychic profit from seeing the work be done.
Oh my god, can I address this? Because there's a fucking there's a straw man to labor theory of value, and then there's a steel man to labor theory of value, okay?
Go for it,
by the way, I'm not even saying Marx fucking understands this shit, because I'm pretty sure his fucking dumb old crotch.
Well, considering it was different in Das Kapital 1 and 3, obviously he doesn't.
Okay, yeah, so basically, like, sorry, this is like a really frustrating conception for me. So I understand, like, using the market in order to determine, like, wages, all that kind of stuff. I think it's more effective than labor theory of value ever could be. I feel like labor theory of value is like shooting into the dark. However, the truth is that institutions do not work without people providing the services that are required in order for them to function. And as a result of those functions being performed, there is then money that is created that can be either turned into capital, or it can be turned into reinvestment, or it can be turned into X, or it can be turned into Y and turned into Z. What most pro-labor people are arguing for, not socialists and not communists, but what most pro-labor people are arguing for, is that if the worker bees are going to dedicate half of their waking lives to turning the machines of capital, then they shouldn't have to work 60 hours a week in order to collapse exhausted into a fucking bed and then not have time to raise their own families. And increasingly, with the K economy, where some people are rich beyond fucking measure and some people can't get by with both parents, like one parent working 2 jobs and the other parent working a full-time job while having kids, I'm deeply sympathetic to the people who are a part of the system who say the system is no longer working for roughly a third of the economy.
But what does a fucking price floor do to that? Like that's the problem. Is that, like,
well, that's why
recognizing that there's a problem doesn't actually, and then just coming up with some cock-brained idea that's been proven to not work isn't a fucking solution. The problem is that this is.
Do you have a problem with the idea that capital and institutions don't function without their workers?
No, you need land, labor, and capital as a means of production. Like, those 3 things are necessary for production: land, labor, and capital.
So do you think it's bad? Maybe not like economically. Just take economics. Just take it out of your brain real quickly. Do you think that if we had a functioning economy in which institutions were able to profit and thrive, but the workers were able to live like reasonably decent and comfortable lives, would be preferable to one in which the institutions are utterly thriving? Like, they're doing whatever the fuck they want to do. They're making money hand over fist. But then you effectively have a third of the population that is kept as indentured servants.
No, I completely agree with you. That's why we need to get rid of minimum wage and get rid of crony capitalism that causes this to be the problem. You know, do things that actually work as opposed to things that we know don't work.
Also making money hand over fist.
My problem, just real quick, my problem is that while I'm talking about like labor and how unions can negotiate like something that works with institutions and all that kind of stuff, I think of the average person as an absolute retard. I think of the average person as like 80 IQ. So when I hear like free market total people be like, oh yeah, you as an individual can negotiate the wages that you are worth, I just think of like sub-zero fucking IQ burger flippers who can barely fucking tie their fucking tennis shoes, let alone negotiate a higher wage. So
if you're a sub-zero burger flipper, then you're probably not worth that much to an employer, number one. But number two, let's say you are, but you're also a retard, right? The fact of the matter is I've got nothing against unions. I've got nothing, like, I have against the state enforcement of them. I have nothing against unions or people having information or activists telling people like, hey, you know, you're worth more than this. You know, like, information failures occur within a market. What I'm saying specifically on this topic is that every way that you look at it, minimum wages don't help. And like, just doing it because it feels good is bad.
Okay,
yeah,
I haven't contested that. But, sorry, final point.
No, I'm saying you can do it. then we got Lactoid who wants to jump in.
Yeah.
Ty, I do want to actually respond to what Scott said previously. But all right, go ahead.
Okay, so this is why I'm a centrist fascist. This is why I've arrived at my politics. Okay, I think that retarded people, despite being retarded, deserve decent lives as well. So just because they're stupid, or they work basic jobs, or the market doesn't like them, or they got fucking ball cancer when they were 2 years old and now they're operating with one testicle, does not mean that they are not deserving of a decent life.
Counterpoints, 100% agreed. That's why you don't want fascism, because they put those people in camps.
Lactoid.
Two quick things. The first thing is, there's an assumption here when you're talking about making money hand over fist. Uber's profit margins are pretty shit in terms of how much money they actually make. I'm pretty sure they've been in the negative almost every single year, every single quarter. They lose a lot of money, right? In fact, the problem is they're not making enough money, right? That's actually one of the negatives of that industry. First thing, so they're not making money hand over fist. They're not expropriating all this money from the laborers. They're actually losing money in terms of they're not getting the good end of the stick in terms of that relationship. First of all, second of all, when you're talking about, I guess going back to your ultimate, and this is more theory, I suppose. When you're talking about your general, the worker bee coming back and not having enough time to relax or anything like this. Two things. First of all, no, I don't think it's fair just because in any kind of market, whether it be an economic market or a sexual market or a relationship market or any other forms of interaction that people have with each other, because that's all a market is, right? That's why it's determined by consumer value and not anything else. I don't think it's fair to dictate terms of what people must associate with when they don't want to, first of all. And second of all, overall median income has been going up for every quartile going back decades. So when you're talking about the economy's not working for people anymore, well, the poorest among us are better off than they were 40 years ago. So, I mean, what do you mean by not working for us anymore?
So I'm pretty sure that cost of living has gone up pretty significantly in reference to pay. And on top of that,
Medium is income per capita, that real income per capita is controlling for inflation. That's been going up for every quintile.
It's only going up for the top two.
No, that's not true.
It's staying stagnant, it's staying equal for the second quintile, and it's going up for the top quintile.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Ty. Because honestly, I wouldn't have thought of that unless you brought it up, and that's one of the things that I wanted to say last time you brought up this point. Just because the top earners are making shitloads more, and then you have the number go up, doesn't mean that the entire group is profiting. This is part of the reason why we're talking about the K economy, where effectively, because of COVID, the shutdowns, not the disease, because the disease is base. Killing boomers is awesome. The shutdowns, basically,
save Social Security for a few months,
is a lot. This
isn't true.
So, all right, you and Ty fight it out. He's the.
No,
he's
we will have to. You can look
at
so it's not average real wages. You look at median real wages. Those have been going up, and then you can break it down by quintile, and it's going up for everybody.
Yeah, it's been going up, but then if you couple that with just the general expenditure rate, look at the difference between 1980 and now. How much does an average house cost you per wage for 1980 versus now? It's almost double.
You can look at very specific
education.
Hold on.
No,
let me clarify. You're both right, and the reason you're both right is that Lactoid, you're correct in terms of general inflation rate, and Tiberius D, you're correct in terms of asset inflation. Home ownership has the expense of home and rent has skyrocketed. Much of that caused by the financial crisis and quantitative easing from the Federal Reserve. But nevertheless, setting that aside, that it's the government's fucking fault, like it is always, is that you're both right in this regard, that it is more expensive to be poor technically once you factor in rent costs and once you factor in the cost of owning a home.
Yeah, but Lactoid, it's kind of funny to me that you were thinking that people were making shit up. So okay, so being poor in America, I'm sure it is better than whatever fucking 30 years ago. Guess what? You got a smartphone. It's worth $1,000. It connects you to the entire internet. You can look at porn on it. It's pretty cool. You can afford a 65-inch TV. They're $300 now. That's awesome. I love it. cars, just the mere technology of cars and how they've advanced over the past century is fucking amazing. And the fact that we even consider it normal for working class and middle class people to own motor vehicles, cell phones, and TVs and internet access and all that kind of stuff is all amazing creations of capitalism that I will never fucking deny. However,
don't forget refrigeration and AC.
Yes, amazing things. However, I feel like the working class has felt like they've been getting pinched since the 60s and 70s, in which point you allegedly, just off of shit I've read, the middle class, the people who were able to work a single job and have mom stay at home and pay their bills, that like fantasy of the American experience is increasingly not happening. And what is happening is two people working in order to survive, and one of those people working a fuckload in order to survive, and them not having time for their kids. That is the increasing experience as far as I understand.
Okay, so I want to go to Ty, and then I do want to actually respond. I want to jump into this.
To some degree, I'm responding. To some degree, I'm adding on. So, just dissect me, and you can tell me to shut up if you need me to. To back up Connor on what he's saying is that, on some ways, we're going kind of back to the norm for what most of American history is, where you do have one parent who's working like 55 hours a week, and the other parent's working somewhere between 20 and 30. That we're getting back to the norm on that one, and whether people like that or not, we can discuss later. What we are having the problem, though, is that we have added on more and more expenses, particularly in what Connor's talking about. These little bastards, your cell phone, right? Average for me is $400 a month when you figure in, or not $400 a month, $400 a year. Excuse me, when you figure in just the average payment process and all the other stuff to replacing it. And when it comes down to it, that's a big chunk of your bill, right? So you might have taken out your TV bill, but then you've got Netflix and Hulu and all this other shit, right? What I'm just trying to advocate for or say is that it is more expensive to live being on every facet of your life, whether you are rich, middle class, poor, is that everyone is seeing, except for like the very top, that decline in their standard of living, because your house is almost twice as much as what it was back in 1980. When you look at the average salary versus the average cost of the home, it's literally now 6 years of salary on average. You're seeing that with healthcare, you're seeing that with education, and you're seeing that with a number of other things that we take for our granted everyday lives.
Just die poor, though.
No, I do want to add one important thing. Putting on my lefty.
No. We gotta let Ty finish.
All right. So just to finish, here's the part where I will absolutely stand the olive branch. A lot of these things is where Scott is somewhat right. The government has their hands in almost all the hardcore perpetrators, whether it's housing and zoning processes, whether it's education and school loan subsidies, whether it is healthcare and just the overrides that we've been doing again and again and again. And I blame Nixon for the big one where he made it let it go profitable. But on the other side of that, there is definitely conversations that we can have that would overhaul these things that would be a lot more constructive. But unfortunately, that's out of the bounds of this conversation. I do not think...
My turn?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. My turn. And Corey, I see you there. All right. So my friend Connor has already made a lot of these points and done it more eloquently. But I'll say my piece, that a society in which laborers are struggling to survive or barely scraping by is a failing society. That a society is not just and maybe shouldn't exist if like the people who make that society work are miserable, right, due to economic concerns that can be avoided. So I am fine with like raising the price floor and allowing more people to access that good life, right? Or that better life, good life. Really making $1,000, not good life. Yeah, I know you're already frustrated. I know.
Before you get triggered,
I'm frustrated because you're saying things that prove to make this worse.
Hey, that didn't say that. Sorry, you might have thought that meant to talk. I didn't mean for that at all. No. Okay. So so there's that. And I think that if there are people who, I would overhaul this entire goddamn system. That's true, right? But I'm working within the constraints of the here and now. I would also have a safety net to catch people, and I'd be investing in who fall through the cracks, and I'd be investing in my citizenry so that they can start new jobs. So we can have more job creation in the first place. I think that's a better way of handling this, right? Well, than saying that, well, just a portion of this population is just going to be immiserated. Rather than that, I'd rather the state intervene. Okay, now
back you up.
All right, fine. Back me up. Say a thing, and then I gotta go, keep going.
I'll shut up for like 10 minutes. I'll literally go get water. So there is a line to this for me that I want Scott and Lactoid to hear from my perspective. I think that socialists and communists say sometimes that this society shouldn't even exist, whereas I would much prefer a productive society in which a third of the population was in misery but still working their asses off but surviving and having cool technology and all that kind of stuff. I would prefer that society over a society that collapses in on its fucking self because it's a command economy that turns into an authoritarian dystopian nightmare. So for me, there is a fucking line. I do trust the market in a lot of respects. I just don't trust it to do everything. And I'll be right back.
That was really backing me up, but okay. But anyway, moving on. Yeah, so hold on. So we'll go to Corey, we'll go to Aiko, we'll go to Lactoid. But I'm actually want to draw on my friend Doobie here. Hopefully he's still around. So the other thing that Scott had talked to me about is automation, right? And saying that if you're raising labor costs, just encouraging businesses to invest in automation, as if that wasn't going to happen already, right? The idea of getting rid of the workers who have a will and who make demands and who have like human interactions that go poorly sometimes, that cost you money and litigation, that thing, yeah, they want that gone. They want that gone, right? So like if there was no minimum wage, right? And we were playing just above, slave wages, right? Just above that, bosses go, well, you know what? This system is going great. I can still, assuming that these disempowered workers can actually sue, yeah, I can still get sued. I still have to provide some level of healthcare. That's assuming that's still a thing, right? There's all these like externalities that happen with labor, like the cost of that they want to get rid of. And if they think that automation can solve that, right, where no one ever fucking talks back and they have total power, and they're going to do it. They're going to do it. So they're doing it any which way. And so the reason
let me respond to that since you called out my point.
You'll get the chance to talk again, I promise. So
don't be a coward. Don't call out a point and straw man it and then not allow me to respond.
Oh, okay. Oh,
don't be a coward.
Oh, dude, shut the fuck up. You get to talk all the goddamn time.
I'm just asking you, please don't be a coward.
I promise you, write it fucking down, and then you can respond to me. All right, write it down. Sorry, you don't get to talk immediately afterwards.
No, it's just weak. It's weak shit.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, but okay, all right, good. Now that you've whined, Doobie. So, like, as a boss, if you had some sort of level of automation, whether it be like full-on fucking robots, I don't know, like androids, or whatever that will look like within your business, that could perfectly replace or even exceed your current workers. Even if you lowered the price of their labor, do you think that you would go for that automation? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, of course. Why not? Like, why wouldn't I?
Exactly. Why wouldn't you? And you have all the.
Eventually, I'll be allowed to respond to that strong.
You will. Yes, I know. Oh my God, I know. Tantrum. Got it. Tantrum. You will absolutely be able to respond. I do want to hear your responses. But your responses take a long fucking time. So I do want to get some other people in, and then yes, Scott, all you. All right. Doobie, do you have anything else you want to say on that? Because
I'm curious because it seems like you're implying that like either employers shouldn't or it would be a bad thing for them to do that. But like, why shouldn't they? Like, from your perspective, if that is your perspective.
Why shouldn't they use automation? I think it depends on the market. Like, I think there are some things that, as of now at least, benefit from human. From human
sure.
hand. And beyond that, because we don't just like the real politics of it all. We don't have an economy or a governmental situation in which we can support those people who have lost their jobs. So I would want to avoid that for now. But like I get it that it's happening any which way. Yeah.
Doesn't so I don't know. I would think that you'd be in favor of automation because like large scale automation is probably the best argument that you're going to find for like something like a UBI popping up, right? I think that would absolutely drive political will in that direction, which gets you closer to your communism or whatever the fuck it is you want.
Yeah, I hear you, and I partially agree about that. But that's why I said like we're not in a policy like situation. Like we haven't moved the Overton window left enough for people to do that yet. And I'm not sure that even if automation, like if rampant amounts of automation happen, that our political system will respond in that way. I don't know. If it did, then okay, then sure. All right. If it gets me what I want, all right, I'm fine. But I don't think that the United States, I don't have faith that the United States will respond that way. Let's go to Corey, Aiko, Lactoid, and then was it Ty? And we go Scott.
Yeah, so to attempt to address, I guess, one of the points that was brought up earlier in terms of like wages, and well, I'm certainly not an expert, but so Lactoid. From what I can tell, the data that you posted in the Discord, like I don't know that it backs up the point that like. So I understand your point that wages have increased, but like the way I sort of see it is like purchasing power, as in like has purchasing power of the average household actually increased? I'm not so sure about that. I would sort of approach it maybe from a different angle of like, let's say, for example, so the Institute of Family Studies, which I consider essentially a conservative think tank. Most people now know that fertility is declining across the United States, and I think also in Canada as well, and that more and more people are, let's say, quote unquote, choosing not to have children. At least according to that data from the Institute of Family Studies, about a third of people are thinking it's like 36% are citing economic reasons as to not having a child. And I believe that trend is going in the wrong direction. So at least when it comes to kind of like family planning, or whether or not wages are increasing, I don't think purchasing power is increasing. And at the very least, it doesn't appear to be affecting, sort of to Connor's point, as in people's ability to have a family and support a family.
Okay, yes, absolutely. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about all the studies that I've been posting in the chat. And I even posted it in Brian's chat, and I posted it in Discord as well. Real wages, real income, that controls for inflation. That's purchasing power. Overall, every single quintile has more purchasing power. They're wealthier than prior, right? I posted that. I knew it was right. I'm not disputing and you guys second guessed me, and I posted all this data showing that once again I was correct. And yes, this could be true that people report not having kids because they have this conception of how much money they want to make and how much more vacations they want to go on, and all of that things. Maybe they value children less than all the money they're making now. That all could be true, right? I mean, I saw a stat earlier: a third of people making over $200K a year live paycheck to paycheck, right? People, yes, they like to blow their money on shit, okay? But the perception of poverty has nothing to do with like the reality of are you better off or not. And I just get a little bit sick of everyone saying like these Americans are struggling so much more than they used to. Like this is just awful in terms of how people are doing, the common man. But like when you look at the data, everybody's doing better. Everybody's doing better. So like what is it?
When you break it down by race.
What the fuck does it have? Okay, so
whites are doing worse.
Sorry.
Okay, maybe, but it's a good thing according to the leftists.
Guys, we gotta let Corey and go. We gotta go down the line here.
Yeah, I do want to, because like, so you just, so I understand your point. Maybe I use purchasing power in an inappropriate context. I'll fully grant that. But I don't think just taking into account inflation is the only factor to take into account. And I think that's, from what I can tell, that was what Tiberius was trying to bring in. And I think even Scott spoke to it in terms of like cost of housing, food, etc. All other, not just inflation. I will totally grant you that wages, when taking inflation into account, is like by your data is going up. But how that actually affects your ability to sustain yourself or sustain a family, I think that's a different question.
Well, no, inflation is a term to describe rising cost of goods and services.
Yeah, no, I understand.
It doesn't. It's usually not measuring asset.
Yeah, that's.
Okay,
Even,
what about
even
expense?
that is affected to a certain degree. So
It-
like
it is impacted by
usually
the-
tracks
What about
fairly
family
well.
expenses?
What I just posted indicated that like since 1980, the real income for the bottom quintile has more than doubled. Okay,
Okay,
Mhm.
what about expenses? What have expenses?
inflation
this is
inflation adjusted.
so important. So what you're telling me is since 1980, working class people have effectively double the money that they used to.
That's what the data shows, and Fred also backs it up, and Pew Research.
Yes.
People have this perception.
So what the
People
fuck is this
always
happy
think the
horse
old
shit
days were
with the
better.
house? So what the fuck is this happy horse shit about fucking like houses and fucking
It's
cars
fucking
and cell phones and cars? So it literally is just avocado toast. All of the fucking imagination.
Yeah.
A lot of it is.
Fuck
We got.
up.
We got.
Some
we
of
gotta
it is,
move
yes,
on.
but not all of it.
Okay,
Oh
so
my
we're gonna go Echo and then Ty because I think Lactoid got out what he wanted to say.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Except it's going to go right back to Lactoid because I wanted to respond to something he said a while back. So, and I actually I don't think you were wrong when you said this, but you talked about how like Uber is not making a profit because they're not able to charge as much as they need to in order to pay them back up for all the expenses that are associated with like everything they do. And I think that's largely right, although they're supposed to have their first profitable quarter this year, but that's not my point.
In history.
Yes. Well, right. I remember articles in the 90s about how Amazon would never turn a profit because they went for years losing money year after year.
Have they
But
made
it
a
was
profit
because they were investing back into themselves is why. But that's not my point here. My point here is that this is a very like low margin business. A lot of it because it takes years and years to establish sort of a new category like this. And to the extent that any of these services raises their prices, then they lose business to all of their competitors. And one potential solution for this is this minimum wage thing, because if you have to pay $18 an hour, it means all of your competitors also have to pay $18 an hour. This is one of the reasons why the CEO of Walmart, after they raised their minimum wage, I think up to $14 an hour, said that they would like to see the federal government do the same thing so that they don't have to compete against other corporations paying lower wages than they do. Amazon made some similar statements about that. In other words, like if your argument is that these companies can't turn a profit and can't pay reasonable wages because of the cutthroat competition coming from their competitors, then one might argue that you're alleviating the pressure of that by making all of their competitors have to increase what they pay as well.
So Lactoid, you can respond, and then we'll go to Ty, and then Scott.
Yeah, it's an interesting theory, I suppose. I don't think this is.
I mean, it's Walmart's and Amazon's.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Walmart said that. I'm sure like a very highly paid PR person said that. I have no doubt whatsoever. After
But
they
you don't
spent,
think
you know,
they'd want their
after they
competitors to
spent
have
how
to
much
pay-
fucking money? Well, hold on. After Walmart spent how much fucking money lobbying against minimum wage increases, and they're going to
Right,
come out
until
with a
they
PR
did
person
it themselves is the point.
Until-
As soon as
yeah,
they
no,
raised
I-
it themselves, they
of
wanted their
course.
competitors to have to do the same thing.
Sure. So yeah, I don't know if I don't think this is actually going to be overall beneficial to Uber. I mean, that's an interesting theory. It doesn't seem to be like empirically backed. Also, overall, fewer customers would seem to actually cut into Uber's profit margin more than it would help. First of all, and second of all, we can also talk about the other industry that has razor thin margins, which is restaurants. Right, this is going to be also impacted. 80% of restaurants fail within 5 years. I think 40% fail after the first year. This is an incredibly cutthroat business. And I mean, this could have an effect on that. Do we really want a world in which fewer people have restaurants? I don't know. I kind of prefer being able to have a variety of places to go and eat. I don't know about you guys, but.
Iko, do you need a response?
Yeah, it's just that, yeah, sure. I mean, both of those effects could happen. Like, that's why I'd like to see like some areas do this and then study it and then see what happens. But I think that the
destroy
razor-thin
some
margins-
restaurants.
The razor thin margins from restaurants also can be alleviated if it turns out that people are willing to pay more, which they apparently do. It seems like no matter how much more expensive Uber gets, like people are still ordering from Uber. Like it's amazing to me, actually, how much people are willing to pay in order to have something delivered instead of going 2 blocks to go fucking pick it up. But it seems like people are like very willing to do it, especially in certain neighborhoods. So I don't know. I mean, this would be a good thing to study, right? So if New York does this, if other places do this, I'd like to circle back in 5 years and see if all of a sudden Restaurant Week doesn't exist anymore in New York because people are making like a living wage doing deliveries.
Well, we could also raise the minimum wage for all restaurant workers as well, so so they don't have the competition.
Yeah.
And then
Please
can,
don't. Please stop giving
everybody.
ideas.
We can just raise the minimum wage.
What is it? $2.18
everybody's minimum wage
for them right now.
We could eliminate competition if we raised everybody's wages to what's the limit, right?
Look, side note, like I think we
Fine.
really need to have a conversation about like tipping jobs and if we want to keep those, but there's a conversation that I want to table for a minute. So let me dissect this for you, Lactoid, because there's a point where like I get where you're a little confused because it's like, all right, we just look at generalized inflation and it's like, wow, the last 40 years have been great. Like 3% inflation is like the historical norm, really kind of low, right? The problem is that when it comes down to like the average wage versus like the things that you're spending on it, yeah, TVs are ridiculously cheap now. They're literally 90% cheaper than what they were back in 2000, right? The problem is like your toys, software, cell phones, that kind of thing. All those dramatically lesser, and that's part of the wonderful capitalist system that we have. Wonderful. The problem is that all the gatekeeping shit that allows you to advance within your own lifetime or to actually facilitate the things that you need to actually have a higher wage, all higher. Childcare is up 112%. Medical care services up 150%. College is up 175%, right? And then just like a general hospital visit. The lowest of these is housing, and it's still up 75%, right? So the issue that we keep having is that while some things on the general level are just cheaper, and that's nice, the things that actually literally matter, like actually taking care of your kids and buying a home for those kids to live in, yeah, those are ridiculously more expensive.
Yeah, Lactoid, and I need to back up Ty on this because this is the question I was asking. Median household real income or whatever doesn't calculate expenses into it, and because it's median fucking household goddamn income, so it doesn't have expenses as a part of the calculation. So effectively, what you said is wages have doubled since 1980 or whatever the fuck that you're looking at. But what you're also not looking at is the cost of everything has also doubled or in some cases tripled. So when you're looking at I don't know how you're shaking your fucking head. You literally just showed me income, not expense. So if what Ty is fucking saying,
it's real income.
Can I explain
so
what
real
I
I know.
So-
Inflation has nothing to fucking do with what we're talking about.
Inflation is measuring the increase of cost of expenses.
Let me describe it, and maybe we can come to consensus. That way, I don't have to fucking lose the blood vessel. Okay. So, if a house, let's say, okay, inflation. As far as I understand inflation, I'm happy to be fucking corrected on it. Okay. As far as I understand inflation, it typically has to do with the fucking the monetary volume and all that kind of bullshit about how much is left in the fucking economy. So how much does a dollar actually pay for? And typically what people are calculating with inflation is every year you're losing about 3%, 5%, 3% of the value of the dollar. It just keeps creeping up because that's basically what we're targeting as an economy. So what I see in your chart is that the inflation has been calculated. So effectively what's happened is in the past 40 years, incomes have doubled. Okay? I understand that. You and I are on the same page. Now, let's talk about expenses separate from this. As far as I know, in 1980, most people did not have a fucking telephone. Most people did not have internet. Most people, like the household itself cost of what it costs right now. And I'm pretty sure like education and all that kind of bullshit, all of that stuff has, some of these things have either doubled or fucking tripled. And also cost of healthcare. What was the percentage on healthcare, Ty?
220%?
So when you add all of these things cumulatively, now you might say like, well, your stuff has gone up 100%. Well, if your income has gone up 100%, but the cost of a house has gone up 175, and the cost of childcare has gone up 225, and the cost of this and that and this and that, cumulatively, what you have is the whatever was excess left over is chipped away. There is no room for American working class families anymore. They do not have savings. They do not have retirement. And on top of that, with workplaces increasingly not having retirement programs and not having health, medical, dental, vision, any of that kind of shit, effectively what you have is a third of the population in a subservient worker servant class in which the expectation is you will be a Walmart greeter when you're fucking 60, you will die without a retirement, you will reverse mortgage your house in order to afford your bills, and you will pass on $0 to your fucking family. That is unacceptable.
So you can respond quickly, Alexa, but we got to go to Ty and then Scott. He's been
Right. So I have no problem admitting that like very specific things may have gone up faster than the general rate of inflation, but this factors in like this is the cumulative effect, right? So the cumulative effect of inflation, when you factor that in, real wages have still gone up. So, you know, all the money you're saving on everything else that people buy,
we got it, guys.
You can spend that on other goods.
We don't have it. We don't have it. We don't have it. Okay. Inflation.
I posted it.
Okay. Inflation.
Okay, so let me actually
hold on.
You're stumbling in the dark.
Of a dollar. Okay, I don't think I am at all, and I think I have an example that'll. I have an example.
You got to do it in 20 seconds. Then we got to let Ty finish because you guys interrupted Ty, and then we'll go to Scott and Corey. All right.
Okay, the market factors are not rawly inflation. There is also supply and demand. So if we have the housing market that because of the collapse in the bubble, and on top of that, they're not building any new construction because of regulations and all that kind of stuff, and the price of a house doubles over the past fucking decade, that is not, as far as I know, that is not a part of the money supply, and it's not calculated in inflation. It has to do with the market price of a house.
Okay,
as far as I know, it's completely disconnected.
It's fine. Ty.
All right, so I want to talk inflation just real quick, and I'll just bang this out. I hate the general idea around inflation because it throws everything together, and we just kind of try to roll with it with CPI. It's absolutely moronic. Most of the inflation throughout world history has been labor inflation because you just have a growing amount of people who are doing more and more things, and it constantly drives up the value of labor because of the fact that they're just doing all the shit, right? And I know that seems a little bit ridiculous, but remind you that people who have money spend money. That's how it works. So what happened is about 1973, everything flipped on side of its head. You had a massive generation of people called the baby boomers, which pushed down the cost of labor because they doubled the size of the workforce in 15 years. That was coupled with a double whammy that we started bringing foreign labor, aka basically East Asia, into the entire market because we started practicing this thing called free trade, which was a disaster.
And women.
Make this long story short is that was the first time that productivity, even through the Great Depression, had separated from the general inflation rate of wages. And ever since then, we have been completely off the mark. Inflation for wages has gone up 103%. Inflation with productivity has gone up 273. That is completely out of the norm. We absolutely screwed this up. And even if you count for automation, it's probably 1/3 of that at best. Because remind you, most of the shit you automate is the stuff that you don't want to do, like digging with a shovel when you hire an excavator.
Let's go to Scott and Corey.
All right. So two things. Going back a little bit, Primecast wanted to attack the idea of automation, but he didn't understand what I was saying, which is I said that it artificially puts automation into the system because inflation kicks down a year or two later. So it incentivizes further automation in a place that it wouldn't necessarily be valuable to either the consumer or the producer of any product, right? So one of the problems here is the doorman fallacy, right? We used to have doormen in front of every hotel. And then there was the invention of automatic doors and revolving doors. Revolving doors and automatic doors made it seem like we don't need doormen anymore. And so all of the hotels started firing their doormen. What they saw is that they had less profit. They lost money because they fired the doorman, because what they didn't realize is that the doorman isn't just opening doors. The doorman is greeting customers. The doorman's answering questions. The doorman is kind of a tour guide to the city when people are visiting. The doorman does a whole bunch of things other than just the job that they thought the doorman was doing. There's also the idea of like psychic profit. Some companies will resist automation because they feel good about hiring people and giving them a meaningful wage for their family. So even though they're not profiting financially, they're profiting via psychic profit. And so the idea is that when you institute things that intentionally incentivize automation, what you're going to get is you're going to get an overuse of automation in industries where it might not actually be good, but the government is essentially mandating this automation, which increases the problem and can actually destroy businesses in the long term because of the doorman fallacy, because they're improperly incentivized to do an action they might not have taken, and that could cost a reduction in profit. So I just wanted to clear that up because Primecast was talking about the idea of automation. That's not what I was talking about. I was talking about the actual economic stuff. Now, in terms of Tiberius D and Lactoid and counterpoints going back and forth, what you don't understand is that there are two major causes here. There are two major problems here. Number one is the Federal Reserve. Okay? The Federal Reserve is to blame for a whole bunch of these fucking problems. When you talk about inflation, you're talking about fractional reserve banking, which is designed to increase inflation that robs wealth from people, as opposed to private banking industries. And it's when people and when millionaires and billionaires are buying houses on loans, and then those loans are putting more money, injecting money into the economy, and they're buying it on assets that they don't fucking have, that shit affects the fucking poor. Right? Because they don't have the ability to get $1 million loans and buy a bunch of properties and then have the loans actually be cheaper than the inflation rate. The second thing that you're missing is what's known as cost disease socialism. And that's exactly what this policy is. It's another form of cost disease socialism. What is occurring is that labor and wages have kept up with productivity. 100%. When you map them, they are a 1-to-1 ratio. Tiberius D is shaking his head, but he's full of shit. It is the tech bros, it is the tech industry, and it is skilled labor like HVAC and plumbing and all of these other things, welding, that have absolutely done great. What isn't doing great is cost disease socialism, which is when the government and people demand that despite there being no increase in productivity of labor, because inflation has increased, the value of those wages must increase. You see this with teachers. And where do you see this? It's great that Tiberius D brought it up because he proves my point. The areas in which the government is the most involved and the areas in which there have been the least increases in productivity, the costs have skyrocketed because of cost disease socialism, because we feel that despite there being basically no innovation in teaching, basically very limited and government controlled innovation in healthcare and things of that nature. Sure, we've had medicines, we've had some tech, but like the government is artificially via the AMA reducing the amount of people that can come in. So there's limited doctors caused by the state. All of these areas where the government is in and where productivity has not increased are the places where prices increase. So if you want to blame the problem, you don't fucking come up with a solution that has been known to be nothing but a problem, which is increases in minimum wage. What you need is you need to get the fucking Federal Reserve out of things, and you need to get rid of fractional reserve banking. And if you're not willing to do those things, then at the very least, you need to get rid of all of the cost disease socialism in industries where productivity has not increased.
But you guys have kept...
I got a couple things.
Yeah, real quickly. Nobody has said minimum wage.
Let Corey. Let Corey go,
I mean,
and then we can.
I'm probably going to lead into you, Counter, anyway, so you should be able to get your point in. But I agree with Scott about automation. We should not automate away Vanna White. But the actual point that I want to make is that, Lactoid, in the Pew research that you cited, hopefully you read it all, but does it not talk about a growing wealth gap and that the wealth of families has stagnated since 2008? Does it not talk? Are there not explicit sections about that? To Connor's point.
So wealth gap, absolutely, right? Especially when it comes to, and it also comes to Americans living paycheck to paycheck, despite the fact their real wages are increasing. I think this demonstrates spending habits among Americans, if anything else.
You have any evidence to support that then?
I mean, yeah, I can find the studies linking like a percent of Americans that live paycheck to paycheck by income strata, and you can see that increasing.
Yeah, but
even people who are making more than $200,000 a year in real wages.
Yeah, but from what I'm understanding, you're tying it to they're just buying bad things, is what I'm understanding, or they're making poor purchasing decisions, or maybe not understanding the point that you're making.
Yeah, or poor purchasing decisions, lack of financial literacy. I mean, that's a major problem as well. That's increasing. You can see by multiple studies indicate that like the newer generations have a lower level of financial literacy, and then also I think this is relevant as well. Yeah, when you factor in inflation, real wages are increasing; they've more than doubled, and that includes house prices. I made sure I verified that right now. That includes house prices. The overall inflation includes house prices, and I don't know why like relation to productivity is necessarily important when we're saying overall wages are increasing. But the overall statement that wages have completely stagnated, that's also not true when you look at total compensation and not just hourly wages.
Okay, maybe Tiberius or fucking Scott need to help me out. Okay, just help me understand this. Okay.
Yep.
So I understand, and I understand that inflation is a part of the calculation. Okay, I get it.
Including housing prices.
Okay, but let's talk about that because maybe that's the problem. Okay, so there are factors in pricing for houses. So for instance, with the house that I'm currently in, I think my parents bought it for like $150,000. And if you were just to go off of monetary inflation, maybe this is part of the communicative problem, it would probably, I guess it would have effectively doubled, right? It'd be worth around $300,000.
What year was it?
1992.
Yeah, double. Literally double this year.
Okay, so
it just depends on where, but yeah.
Well, and that was going to be my next
inflation.
point. That was going to be my next point. So just inflation as a factor of consumption, my house should be effectively double. So it should be at 300,000. But my house isn't at 300,000. It's at 500,000. The reason why it's at 500,000 is because everybody in this fucking neighborhood in Central Florida, the entire state of Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, California, they all decided that they either didn't want to be cold or they didn't want to be in California anymore, and they moved in, along with a healthy chunk of Chinese and Iranian people who decided that if their states collapsed, they wanted to have a backup plan in Central Florida. So as a result, there's another 20 to 30% increase in the housing cost. And not just that, but there was a lot of construction up until 2008. And then basically in the state of Florida, as far as I know, the developers have sat on the market. They're just now starting to do new developments probably within the past 5 years. So if inflation accounts for my house doubling in price, but other people are coming into the market and there's an extra $200,000 worth of value that they cannot purchase, they can't afford it, then how is what I'm saying about purchasing things not accurate, where shit is just more expensive?
This
Okay.
is what I tried
So,
to.
let me respond to that because maybe this is just a miscommunication. Okay, I do not deny that there are certain classes of goods and services, including housing, perhaps, that have risen faster than other things. Okay. Well, what I'm saying is that when you take your average person, your median person, your run-of-the-mill person, in any quartile of income, right? The shit they spend money on, housing included, but also everything else, the median in America, right? They have overall since the 1980s, right? That's doubled in terms of their income. Okay. So are certain things a lot cheaper? Yes. Are specific things more expensive? Yes. Is this going to change depending on where you are? If you're in the middle of Florida or New York or San Francisco or very specific, hyper-specific areas? For sure, right? You're going to have variations, right? My overall point, and is that exacerbated by the lockdown? There might, yes, absolutely, there could be issues there. We saw wage increases, but we also saw inflation. We see inflation. We're still feeling inflation. This is absolutely true. All this is true. But that does not detract from the point, which is that when you, instead of cherry picking specific asset classes, instead of cherry picking specific things, well, look at this very specific thing. This rose in price by this amount. When you look at everything, right? When you look at inflation and you compare that with the wage growth, like in terms of to get a real wage increase, you're at every single quintile, Americans are better off. In fact, in terms of median wealth, median income per capita, Americans are number one in the world, right?
So counterpoints, I'll switch sides for you because you asked me. Well, he asked me to help him explain.
Let me grab a baby and then I'll
we
listen.
gotta tie Corey because they're waiting, and
That's fine.
I definitely want to move
Go ahead.
past this. Oh, okay.
Okay,
Oh,
I'll go
okay,
first.
we're
So to answer this is like, all right, Lactoid, I get where you're like, all right, we're cherry picking. And this is the part where, like, ironically, Scott's kind of right and wrong at the same time that kind of invalidates you. And this is why. All right. So Scott's absolutely right that there's certain things that the government did do that absolutely hurts. And I will agree with him when it comes to college.
Still does.
I'll largely agree with you when it comes to housing. Right. The thing, though, that is also the stupidly strong correlation is that all of this that has been incredibly more expensive has been skilled labor, because all of that has been largely going up, at least to some degree, with the trend line. It is the unskilled labor and everything that they used to make that is now ridiculously cheap. And that's what we've seen since largely the 1980s, is that labor collapsed back in the 70s. It's never kept pace. And then once the Soviet Union collapsed and China came on board the international system, commodities became incredibly cheap. And so that's why we've been skating along at 2% average inflation year upon year upon year. We saw no labor inflation, we saw no commodities inflation, and the only inflation that we largely saw was asset inflation. That was your house, that was things that actually generated value. And then all of a sudden, whenever that system started melting away because the Russians decided to throw a war, everything started going back to normal. And we've seen more commodities inflation in the last 2 years than we've seen in the last 40 years combined. That's the difference.
Corey.
Look, the recent inflation is.
Let's grab Corey.
Oh, sorry, I was just trying to answer his question. Yeah.
Well, I'll try to be brief. But again, I guess continue on in the same vein. So Lactoid, going back to the point that it earlier made of like, yeah, the own research that you cite talks about this growing inequality. And again, going back to that research, they even cite the fact that the U.S. has a growing inequality compared to other equivalent countries or peer countries, as they stated. Are you saying that this disparity among equivalent countries is due to, you know, some unique situation of like more financial illiteracy in the United States in comparison to those countries, or like what is it that's making the U.S. lag behind these other peer countries then?
Okay, so pay attention to the very specific claim I'm making. Okay, I'm comparing the U.S. to the U.S. 40 years ago. That's the comparison. I don't disagree that inequality in the U.S. is growing faster and historically been higher than a lot of places in Europe, which you would expect considering how much more redistribution programs that they have, especially in the Nordic countries. Of course, that's I don't deny that, but I'm not debating that that's not the case. That we have more inequality, right? What I'm arguing is that on every single quintile in the past 40 years in the U.S., people overall are better off. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. I'll try to be
significantly. And the median wage earner is better in America than anywhere else on the planet.
Now, from my perspective, you pivoted. As in, like, when I talk about inequality in the U.S. and comparing it over time, you use the argument, well, you know, if you look at it, there's less financial literacy and poor purchasing decisions. And then I bring in other countries. Well, no, now it's greater income distribution in those countries. And so, like, that's like
I thought you said wealth accumulation, or like status of wealth accumulation compared to 40 years ago in the U.S. Were you comparing that to European countries? Because if that's the case.
No. In the actual research, Pew Research article that you cited, there's multiple sections. It's a long article, multiple pages I'm going through it. But there's a section that, like, yes, it seems like for a certain portion of Americans, wealth has stagnated, I think, since 1980, as they cite. And then there's a separate section when they talk about inequality. There is a growing inequality, and they compare it to other, I think, G7 countries specifically, in that there appears to be this unique situation in the United States where there's this growing inequality, where the rich, as you know, the typical argument, the rich are getting richer, and it appears like the poor are getting poorer, or like they're stagnating. Well, I take your point that your argument is very specific, that median income is maybe going up over time. But when it comes to the overall outcomes of, let's say, people and individuals and families, I would make the argument, a separate argument, that I don't think outcomes are getting better.
No. So when I say the poor are getting poorer, or when you say the poor are getting poorer, are you talking about in terms of like the percentage relation to the wealthy, or are we talking in absolute terms? Because what I'm saying, the only claim I made is that the bottom quintile has seen their wages double. Their real inflation-adjusted wages. Is it true that the wealthy have gotten wealthier? Sure. But that doesn't contradict anything I'm saying.
Okay, Lactoid. There's
okay.
two problems.
I want to answer.
Scott, I want Scott to be able to answer, and then counterpoints. I'm wanting to check out of this, but go ahead, Ty.
Counterpoints. You're trying to understand like this idea of like asset inflation and how like this seems to be like the major causes, right? When we take all of this data together, what we recognize is that most goods are much cheaper. Commodities are cheaper. tech things are cheaper. A lot of things are cheaper. What's not cheaper is education, healthcare, and housing. These are things that many people, especially lefties, almost consider human rights, right? These are things that are incredibly important. And you're like, so let's look at the example you gave, which is housing, right? Under capitalism, right? And this is the problem. This is the economic calculation problem, is that once central planners get involved in these markets, they're not able to actually be able to respond as well as the market does, because the market uses price signals. So what you have to understand about Florida is, yes, because of lockdowns and because Florida did really well with the lockdowns comparatively to the rest of the country, a lot of people kind of moved to Florida in a short period of time. And this causes an increase in prices. Now, under a capitalist economy, which we do not have in America, we have something that's capitalistic, right? Under a capitalist economy, what happens is prices increase and then construction companies move in. They're like, ooh, this is the place to make money. So they move in until prices stabilize again, because a whole bunch of people want to live in this area. But what we have instead is we have capitalistic tendencies in a mixed market economy with the Federal Reserve. And so what you have is the process I explained earlier, where the ultra wealthy invest in real estate, and then they just sit on fucking properties. They don't even use the property. So real housing doesn't go up despite the ownership of housing, and all kinds of other problems. And then you have the government that puts in tons of regulations, tons of like we had Trump in his war with China on fucking steel imports, right? And tariffs in that regard. You have the government is involved in so many zoning restrictions, and it's worse in places where the government is worse, right? When you look at California, for example, like there are people in California that own a fucking apartment building, and they've been trying to get the rights to finish their apartment building for 3 years, and the government won't let them, and they eventually just abandon it in the place with all the homeless people. So where you have heavy government involvement in the market where they're not capable of responding to price demands and heavy regulation, what is the most regulated industry in America? Healthcare. Where have costs gone up the most in America? Healthcare. You have this inability of the market to respond in this regard. And all the while, when we talk about inflation, all you guys are talking about it like prices are increasing. And while that is one way of viewing it, because that is actually, what it is, it's also what it technically is, right, is the amount of money in the market, the amount of money that is in the market. That's monetary inflation. And the reason we have more money, more inflation, is our fractional reserve banking system. What you're really talking about is robbery against the American public by the Federal Reserve. And we keep talking about it like rising prices, and it's affecting the poor the most.
Okay, so
Okay. I think
there's
someone
like
else
two really.
wants to-
I know you're not interested in this stuff, but there's actually two really important points.
I get it.
And we could always go back to minimum wage, but y'all were getting
Hold on.
dunked on that.
Yeah. You know what? Go ahead, Connor. I'm not sure if anyone else wants
Okay,
to jump in.
so yeah, there were. Okay, so there's
Oh,
2
sorry.
points. There's 2 points that I want to address with Lactoid. So one is that the asset classes that we're talking about are not arbitrary. They're the most important asset classes that we could possibly talk about, which is basically being able to afford a house, being able to afford your education, so you can get access to the higher tier jobs, and then being able to, afford your fucking healthcare and all that kind of shit. To Scott's point, these are areas where the government has been heavily involved. I actually think that we have the worst of both worlds, because effectively what we should see is some kind of subsidization that like oversupplies the market, so we have a decrease in price. But what we actually end up having is like regulation that then artificially decreases the amount of stuff that we can get. And we also have giant social calamities like the 2007 housing crisis, where they basically just built fucking everything they wanted to and then let it all crash down when because of subsidization. Now, the other thing too is I'm okay with conceding the point that people are better off because of their real income has effectively doubled for the past 20 years. But what I'm also asking you to concede in material reality is the fact that 2007 to 2008, like, Americans lost 40% of their fucking wealth. Like, working class and middle class Americans lost 40% of their wealth, and it has sat there for the past decade.
Lost
because
way more during the
they're doing-
lockdowns.
and they're doing all they're doing is they're subsisting. So what you had in the 90s and the thousands was this really bullish attitude about the prospects of the American future, where working class and middle class people were going to benefit from low unemployment, they were going to benefit from tech, they were going to benefit from new technologies, they were going to benefit from globalization, they were going to have the best economic future possible because of all these crazy things that have happened. And instead what we got was the global war on terror, like a $54 trillion deficit, or $54 trillion debt at the federal level. We had a housing collapse in 2007, 2008, and we've had people's wealth stagnate for the past 13 years. So if like you can say like, hey, we're marginally better off, and on top of that, it's not so bad. I'll agree that it's not so bad. It's probably still the best on the planet. Doesn't mean that the middle class and working class don't have the right to feel fucked over.
Okay, so finally, Ty, you got 2 minutes. Knock it out.
Yeah, I'll just use this as my closing because we're up to that point anyway. So I think we've kind of gone full circle, and I'll use this as my wrap up in the regards that Corey's last point really does showcase like where I was trying to go with this. There's a couple of things that I agree with Scott with, and I already outlined that, but it comes down to this. If you look at Europe, who went down that leftist train, they used to be over 25% of the world economy. They're now under 15 because they failed to innovate. They failed to industrialize or keep pace with any kind of ability that we really think is normal. They outsourced it all to East Asia, which is, we'll talk about that last point. But when it comes to them is that they went down this train. It didn't work out for them. America still tried to keep its innovativeness. Now, unfortunately, that didn't mean that all Americans were able to do this. If you were skilled labor, if you were a computer programmer, or you were a doctor, or you were a teacher, you largely got to ride that train, and you could still pay your bills. But if you were somebody who was competing with a billion East Asians that all of a sudden were doing the same jobs that you could, you got screwed. And while it's been nice for them because they have seen the quality of their life quadruple in literally 20 years, yours has slowly been bleeding, dying, and drying. Because when you take all the wealth and all the ability that you have economically and you give it to somebody who can outcompete you on every single level when it comes to wages, they're going to win. And that's really what the problem is that we've gotten in ourselves there. We cannot compete with people who make dollars a day.
Okay. All right. So we're moving on.
To the next topic?
Yeah, we're going to the next topic.
What?
Yeah. We're going to move on to the next topic.
Can it just be for the record?
Just Google Kuznets curve if you want to understand what Tiberius D is talking about.
And then I just want to say for the record, I had very critical and defeating points to defeat counterpoints with, but we're moving on. So unfortunately, I can't put them forward.
Yeah, of course.
They would absolutely shatter.
Annihilate my butthole.